The memo was under my left shoe. Not metaphorically. I mean, there was a folded piece of official Galactic Housing Authority paper pressed flat beneath my sneaker, and I had been using it as a coaster for my coffee mug for the better part of 3 weeks because the kitchen counter had a wobble on the left side, and I never got around to fixing it. I pulled it out, unfolded it, read it standing at the kitchen sink in my boxers at 7 in the morning, eating cereal dry because we were out of milk again, and the first sentence I read was not the title, not the greeting, not the formal salutation from the GHA Regional Compliance Office. The first sentence I read was a footnote. Footnote 7, to be precise. It said, "Cohabiting non-Vendari individuals are advised that resonance seeking is involuntary, operates outside the conscious control of the Vendari party, and is non-transferable across species boundaries. The GHA assumes no liability for psychological or physiological responses in non-Vendari cohabitants during active Veldara cycles." I put my cereal bowl down. I read the footnote again. Then I read the title of the memo, which I had skipped the first time because I was focused on footnote 7. The title said, "Notice of Active Veldara Cycle for Registered Resident Vethka of Unit 4C, Galactic Housing District 7, Portland Sector. Mandatory compliance guidelines enclosed." I looked at the hallway. There was a shelf there. A nest shelf, technically, though I had not known that word 3 weeks ago when it appeared. It was built from what I could only describe as woven light material, bioluminescent fiber, that Vethka had assembled over the course of 2 nights while I was asleep, and it stretched from the left wall to about halfway across the corridor, roughly at shoulder height for me, which meant I had been ducking under it every morning on my way to the bathroom. I had assumed it was an alien home improvement project. I had thought about asking about it. I had not asked about it, because Vethka and I had a comfortable arrangement built on mutual non-intrusiveness, and I did not want to be the guy who made a big deal out of structural modifications to the shared hallway. That was 3 weeks ago. I started reading from the top of the memo. The Vendari are a cephalopod-adjacent species, 7 feet average height, bioluminescent chromatic patches running from the base of the neck to the upper shoulder blades, capable of communicating through skin color modulation in frequencies that most translation software handles at roughly 60% accuracy. The remaining 40% comes out as things like untranslatable, see emotional category, longing, or insufficient human linguistic equivalent. Consult supplemental glossary. Vethka had been my roommate for 14 months. I knew she liked the apartment cold. I knew she kept her section of the refrigerator organized by molecular density, which I had initially found baffling and had eventually found helpful, because it meant I always knew exactly where my food was relative to hers by a consistent logic. I knew she worked in xenobiological research at the university, same campus where I was doing my PhD in anthropology, which was how we had ended up at the same housing board meeting 14 months ago, arguing over the last affordable unit in the building. We had solved it by splitting it. She took the larger bedroom. I took the smaller one, and the parking spot I did not need because I did not own a car. It had been a good arrangement. I was now reading a government document informing me that my roommate was in the middle of an alien breeding season and had been for approximately 23 days. I flipped to page 2. Veldara, according to the GHA compliance document, occurs in adult Vendari every 4 to 7 years. Duration ranges from 30 to 60 days. Behavioral changes include heightened emotional sensitivity, nest construction instinct, pheromone emission beginning at day 14 of the cycle, and what the document called resonance seeking, which it defined as the instinctive orientation of the Vendari individual toward a stabilizing external presence that can tolerate the chromatic and biochemical output of peak Veldara without significant disruption. It said most non-Vendari species cannot tolerate proximity to a Vendari during peak Veldara. It said the recommended protocol for non-Vendari cohabitants was temporary relocation. It said the GHA provided emergency housing vouchers for this purpose. I looked at the hallway nest shelf again. I looked at my cereal bowl. I finished reading the memo, all 11 pages, including the appendices, which contained a species-by-species breakdown of documented pheromone sensitivity responses, a chart of chromatic output frequencies and their corresponding neurological effects on non-Vendari nervous systems, and a 2-page section on what the document called the anchor bond phenomenon, which I would come back to later. I set the memo down on the counter. I poured myself another bowl of cereal. The apartment smelled different than it had a month ago. I had noticed it in a vague, background way, the way you notice a neighbor has started cooking something new, a smell that was not unpleasant but was very present, electric and warm, like the air before a thunderstorm that had somehow also been to a museum. I had thought the building was doing something with the ventilation. I had not given it serious thought. I give a lot of things less serious thought than they probably deserve. I was thinking seriously now. The door to Vethka's bedroom opened. She was 7 feet and 2 inches. She had to angle herself through the doorframe. Her bioluminescent patches, which were usually a calm, deep blue-green at rest, the color of water through thick glass, were doing something I had never seen them do before. They were shifting, moving through colors without settling. Amber to violet, to a pale gold that the morning light caught and scattered across the kitchen ceiling. My translation app, which I kept on my phone for moments when chromatic communication moved faster than Vethka wanted to speak aloud, buzzed once in my pocket. I pulled it out. The screen said, untranslatable. See emotional category. Longing. I put the phone back in my pocket. Vethka looked at me. She looked at the memo on the counter. She looked at my cereal bowl. She said, in the careful, precise English she had been speaking since her 2nd year on Earth, "You found the document." "It was under my shoe," I said. "I've been using it as a coaster." She was quiet for a moment. "For how long?" she said. 3 weeks, give or take." Another pause. Her patches shifted through something fast, and then settled to a color I did not have a translation for. I said, "I'm going to need you to explain what nest building means for the security deposit." She looked at the hallway shelf. She looked back at me. And then Vethka, who in 14 months of shared living had never once made a sound that I would describe as a laugh, made a sound that was exactly a laugh. Low, resonant, like a cello played in a different room. "The fiber is self-dissolving after the cycle ends," she said. "There will be no damage." "Good," I said. "Cool, cool, cool. Okay." I leaned against the counter. "Walk me through the rest of it." She walked me through the rest of it. She explained Veldara in the same tone she used to explain her research data, which was to say clearly, and without dramatics. "The pheromone emission had begun on day 14, she said. She had expected me to relocate. She had deliberately not woken me to tell me, because the document should have arrived 3 weeks prior, and she had assumed I had read it. I had not read it, I said. "No," she said. "I see that now. How far in are we?" "Day 23. "And the pheromones? They affect different species differently," she said. Her patches did the amber shift again. "The Threx couple on floor 4 became agitated approximately 6 days ago. The Meridan student on floor 3 began exhibiting what I believe is grief-adjacent behavioral withdrawal 4 days ago. I received a message from the building management yesterday. Several tenants have requested temporary relocation assistance. I thought about the last week. I thought about why I had felt mildly nostalgic every morning, for no reason I could put a name to, a low background hum of memory and something adjacent to longing, like a radio station 1 frequency off from the one you wanted. I had assumed it was PhD stress. It usually was. "I feel fine," I said. Vethka looked at me with an expression I had learned to read over 14 months. It was the expression she made when something did not match her data. "Yes," she said, "that is also something I will need to explain." I got out a notebook. I took notes. This was, I would later think, very on-brand for me. My roommate of 14 months was in the middle of an alien breeding season and had been for 3 weeks. The building was in low-level chaos, and my first instinct was to get a notebook. I wrote down Veldara, resonance seeking, anchor bond. Check Appendix C. I wrote down Security deposit. Okay, nest shelf is temporary. I wrote down, call building management. Ask about emergency housing voucher process in case this gets worse. I did not write down the thing I had felt when I read footnote 7, the small, quiet thing that sat at the base of my chest when I read non-transferable across species boundaries. The relief. I did not write that down because I was not ready to look at it yet. Vethka sat across from me at the kitchen table. Her patches had settled into a color that was new, that I had never seen on her before. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I did not pull it out. I looked at her instead, at the slow shifting light of her, and I said, "How are you doing?" Actually. She considered this. Veldara is not a comfortable process, she said. The resonance seeking is involuntary. It creates a sustained orientation toward proximity with a stabilizing presence. Without that proximity, the cycle is significantly more distressing. She paused. I was managing. Were you going to say something? If I hadn't found the memo. Another pause. Longer. I was uncertain how to initiate the conversation, she said. I nodded. I wrote in my notebook she was going to tough it out alone. Then I put the notebook down and said, "Okay, so what do you need?" Her patches did the amber thing, then the pale gold, then something the app would have called untranslatable, and I was starting to think maybe the app was just not trying hard enough. She said, proximity, consistency, someone who does not leave. I looked at the hallway shelf. I looked at my notes. I looked at the memo on the counter, 11 pages of official government documentation that I had been using to keep my coffee mug from wobbling for 3 weeks. I wrote 3 emails to my thesis advisor, explaining that I would need to work remotely for the foreseeable future, due to an unexpected cohabitation situation. I did not send any of them. I made more cereal. This time, I found the milk. I sat back down at the kitchen table, and Vethka sat across from me, and her patches did their slow, shifting thing in the morning light, and I thought about all the documents I had let sit unread, all the things I had not asked about, all the mornings I had ducked under that shelf without thinking to ask what it was. I thought about how much easier it is to not know a thing than to know it and have to decide what to do. Then I stopped thinking about that, because I had already decided, without making a decision, 3 weeks ago, when I ducked under the shelf the first time and thought, alien IKEA project, and went to make my coffee. I had already decided. I just hadn't read the memo yet. Outside, down the hall, the Threx couple was arguing loudly about a houseplant in a language my app rendered as defensive territorial assertion, subcategory, domestic. The Meridian student was playing something soft and low through her ceiling that my app translated as, and I am quoting directly here, funeral hymns for future regrets. I finished my cereal. I opened my laptop and started working on my thesis chapter. The apartment smelled like thunderstorms and museums, and Vethka's patches cast slow-moving color across the kitchen wall, and somewhere in the building people were having various forms of mild crisis, and I was fine. Mildly congested. Bit nostalgic. That was it. The building had a group message thread. I know because I was on it, had been on it since I moved in, and had approximately never participated in it except to respond to the January reminder about parking permits with a thumbs up. It was a quiet thread. 14 months of relative peace. Day 24 of Veldara. That thread woke up. It started at 6 in the morning, with a message from the Threx couple on floor 4, whose names I had never successfully learned to pronounce and had internally been calling Neighbor A and Neighbor B since October. The message was in Threx, which my app rendered as, "The air is wrong. The air has been wrong for many days. We request ventilation inspection or immediate building authority intervention." By 7, the Meridian student, whose name was something like Sorry, but that might have been the translation software's best approximation, had messaged that she was unable to leave her bathroom due to an acute and unexpected emotional state she described as pre-grief for experiences not yet had, and was there a number she could call. By 8, 4 more units had reported disruption. The Vreth researcher on floor 2, who I had always found intimidating, sent a message that simply said, "This building is no longer suitable for habitation. I am contacting the GHA directly." My phone was buzzing constantly on the kitchen table. I was eating toast, reading the messages in sequence, and I felt fine. Specifically, I felt mildly nostalgic again, that same low background radio station feeling, and my sinuses were slightly congested, and I had woken up that morning thinking about a summer 3 years ago in a way that was specific and vivid but not painful, like finding an old photograph you had been glad existed. I noted this in my thesis notebook because I was an anthropologist, and the thing happening in my building was objectively the most interesting fieldwork I had stumbled into since my second year of grad school. I wrote, Day 24. Pheromone response in non-Vendari cohabitants appears to operate at species-specific emotional frequency. Threx, territorial/defensive. Mriadan, anticipatory grief. Vreth, fight response. Human, self, mild nostalgia, slight sinus congestion, no significant behavioral disruption noted. I underlined the last line. Then I went to make soup. I am not a soup person. I want to be clear about that. I have never in my life spontaneously made soup. I owned exactly one pot that was large enough for soup, and I used it primarily for pasta. But I stood at the kitchen counter at 8:15 in the morning and thought, Vethka has not eaten properly in 2 days, and I know this because I had been watching the refrigerator and her section, organized by molecular density, was untouched, and I had been to the store yesterday and bought ingredients that I could now see, laid out on the counter, were apparently for soup. I had not made a conscious decision to buy soup ingredients. I had just bought them. I made the soup. It was a simple one, vegetable-based, nothing complicated, because I did not know what Vendari dietary preferences were during Veldara, and I did not want to guess wrong. I had looked it up the night before in the GHA supplemental guide. Mild, warm, high in specific mineral compounds that Vendari bodies needed during high-output biological cycles. The guide listed compatible earth foods. Vegetable broth was on the list. I made the soup. Vethka's door was closed. She had been in there since before I woke up. I knocked. I made food, I said. I don't know if you want it. It's just there if you want it. A pause. Then her door opened. She looked worse than she had the day before, not in any way I could point to directly. Her posture was the same, her height the same. Her voice when she said hello was the same careful, precise English, but her patches were doing something different. They were cycling faster, moving through colors without holding any of them, amber, violet, gold, violet, amber, again, restless in a way that I recognized from human faces, even if I had never seen it in bioluminescent patches. She looked exhausted. She looked like someone who had been alone with something too big for too long. I did not say any of that. I said soup's on the stove. I have no idea if I made it right, so no promises. She followed me to the kitchen. She sat at the table. I put a bowl in front of her and sat across from her with my toast and my phone and my thesis notebook, and I kept my eyes on my notes, because she was eating and I did not want to make it a thing. The building thread was still going. I scrolled through it. The Vreth researcher had contacted the GHA and received an automated response directing them to apply for emergency temporary housing. 3 units had already applied. The thread was a low-grade, polite panic. I noted in my notebook, human instinct appears to be to manage logistics rather than evacuate. Unclear if this is adaptive or simply obstinate. You are taking notes, Vethka said. Thesis chapter, I said. Cross-species cohabitation stress responses. This is technically the best fieldwork I've had access to in 2 years. She looked at my notebook, then at me. Her patches did one smooth, slow sweep to a color I had started to think of as her evaluating color, the one she made when she was recalibrating her understanding of something. You are not distressed, she said. Mildly congested, I said. Bit nostalgic, that's been pretty much it. She set down her spoon. She said, Jessie. I looked up. The average non-Vendari tolerance threshold for pheromone exposure at this concentration is between 6 and 14 hours before significant behavioral or neurological disruption occurs. She paused. You have been in this apartment for 24 days. I put my pen down. Huh, I said. The Galactic Housing Authority record for human cohabitation with a Vendari during active Veldara is 9 hours, she said. That case involved a research volunteer in a controlled environment with intermittent exposure intervals and full protective gear. Cool, I said. You have been making soup, she said. You hadn't eaten. She was quiet for a long time. Her patches had stopped cycling. They had settled, for the first time in days, into something slow and steady, a color that was deep and warm, and that my phone, when I silently reached for it and aimed the camera at her without asking, translated after a 3-second processing delay as sufficient. I looked at the word on my screen. I put my phone face down on the table. I thought about my last roommate, Owen, who had left a post-it note on the kitchen counter that said, "Found a better place. Taking the TV. Good luck." I had come home from campus to find the post-it note and the absence of the TV and a dent in the wall where the stand had been, and I had stood there for a while reading the note, and then I had thrown it away and ordered pizza and not mentioned it to anyone for about 3 months. That was the thing about being the person who gets left. You get very good at not making it into a story. You get good at making soup when someone hasn't eaten, at sitting across the table and keeping your eyes on your notes, at staying present without calling it anything. I did not think about that for long. I picked my pen back up. In the hallway, I could hear the Threx couple's argument escalating again. The words my app caught in passing included mine and wrong and did not ask for this. Through the ceiling, the Meridian students' funeral hymns had gotten quieter but more frequent, little loops of them at intervals, like a metronome set to grief. I wrote in my notebook, Day 24, continued. The human instinct, observed in self, does not appear to be to assess the extraordinary nature of the situation and respond with appropriate alarm. The human instinct appears to be to make soup and take notes. Unclear if this is a flaw or a feature. Then the building thread announced that the GHA was sending a representative. I looked at the message. Then I looked at Vethka, who was eating the soup, whose patches had settled into that slow, warm color my app called sufficient, and I thought, a government representative is going to arrive and find me eating toast in a kitchen that smells like thunderstorms and museums, with my alien roommate, who is in the middle of a breeding season I didn't know about for 23 days because I was using the warning memo as a coaster. I wrote in my notebook, this is going to be an interesting week. I was, even by my own modest standards, dramatically underestimating the situation. The representative arrived the next morning. I heard the knock before Vethka did, which I had come to understand over the last 4 days was notable, because Veldara had made her senses significantly more acute, and she had been tracking sounds and movements through the apartment walls in a way that she had explained, without emotion, was involuntary. She heard things before I did. She heard the Threx couple's arguments in full detail 2 floors up. She had known the Meridian student's name before I did because she had heard someone say it through the floor. So when I heard the knock first, I processed this information, filed it in my notebook, and went to answer the door. The GHA representative was a Brelk, which is a species I will attempt to describe and immediately acknowledge that my description will be inadequate. Brelk are approximately 5 feet tall, bilaterally symmetric, and have the kind of face that evolution designed for conveying a wide range of bureaucratic displeasure with maximum efficiency. This one was carrying a datapad and a case, and was wearing a jacket with the GHA insignia on the left chest, and before I had fully opened the door, it had already looked past me into the apartment and then looked back at me with an expression I would describe as concerned professional disbelief. "Jesse Calloway?" it said. My app rendered its voice as mid-register, neutral, regional accent, galactic administrative standard. "That's me," I said. "You are the registered non-Vendari cohabitant of Unit 4C. For 14 months, yeah. It looked past me again. Its eyes, which were large and very good at conveying information, landed on the hallway nest shelf, then on Veth Ka, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway, and then on the kitchen table, where my thesis notebook was open, and my coffee was sitting, and there were 2 bowls from last night's soup still in the drying rack. "You are still in the unit," it said. "Correct," I said. It said, "Mr. Calloway, the GHA issued mandatory compliance documentation approximately 46 days before the projected onset of your cohabitant's Veldara cycle. That document included a specific recommendation for temporary relocation of all non-Vendari cohabitants no later than day 14 of active pheromone emission." "So, day 14, I said. "Right. About that." I stepped back from the door. "Do you want coffee?" It came inside. I want to say that the next 2 hours were complicated, but they were actually very simple in the way that things are simple when one party has a 19-point compliance checklist and the other party is eating cereal and asking clarifying questions. The Brelk representative, whose name I eventually got my app to render as something close to Administrator Lon, went through its checklist with the thoroughness of someone who had never had to deviate from the checklist and was finding the experience disorienting. It administered what it called a standard cognitive disruption assessment, a series of questions designed to measure neurological and psychological displacement in non-Vendari individuals exposed to Vendari pheromones above threshold concentration for extended periods. I answered all the questions. It scored my results. It looked at the results. It looked at me. It looked at the results again. "You are scoring in the 97th percentile," it said, "for pheromone-resistant stable cognition." "Is that good?" I said. "It is," it said carefully, "statistically anomalous." It made a note on its data pad, the kind of note that looked significant, the kind that gets turned into a report that gets flagged and reviewed and eventually ends up in a database under a category like positive anomaly, though I did not know that yet. Vethka, from the kitchen doorway, made a sound. I had learned this sound. It was not a laugh, exactly, but it was the color of one, the small involuntary sound she made when something aligned with a prediction she had already made. Her patches shifted into the color my app called pride, variant, possessive, and she went back into the kitchen. Lon watched her go. Then it looked at me with the specific expression of someone confronting something their training materials did not cover. "Mr. Calloway," it said, "are you aware of what your continued presence in this unit means, from a Vendari behavioral standpoint?" I said, "I read the memo. I know about the anchor bond section in Appendix C. And you are still here." "She hadn't eaten," I said, "and the nest shelf doesn't affect the security deposit." I checked. Lon wrote something on its data pad. Then it pulled me quietly to the side of the room, close to the front door, and lowered its voice in a way that suggested it was trying to give me information it felt I deserved to have before I made any more decisions. "The anchor bond," it said, "is not a casual designation in Vendari culture. A Vendari who tolerates the proximity of a non-Vendari at peak Veldara, who constructs a shared nest structure, who enters what the documents classify as stable resonance with a non-Vendari individual, is making what their culture considers a permanent declaration." "The document said non-transferable across species," I said. "The bond is non-transferable," Lon said, "meaning the biological effects of the bond cannot be transferred. The cultural meaning of the bond is fully intact regardless of species." It paused. "She is, by every Vendari framework, declaring you her anchor, permanently." I looked toward the kitchen. Vethka was at the counter, making tea. Her patches were doing the slow, warm thing that my app called sufficient, the color she had been settling into more and more over the last few days. I said, "What does she get out of it?" Lon looked at me. "What do you mean?" it said. "She gets a stabilizing presence," I said. "Someone to get through Veldara with. I understand what I'm providing. What does she actually get from committing to an anchor bond long term? What does the designation mean for her?" Lon was quiet for a long moment. The Vendari anchor bond, it said slowly, is the highest form of chosen relationship in their culture. It is not reproductive, it is not obligatory. It is the designation of the one individual a Vendari trusts, above all others, to remain. I thought about that. Okay, I said. You understand the permanence, Lon said. I understand permanence, I said. It looked at me. Then it wrote something very long on its data pad in what I suspected was a language I would not have been able to read even with my translation app. I went to the kitchen. I poured Vethka's tea and mine and sat at the table. She sat across from me. Her patches did the amber thing, then the pale gold, then the color that my app kept rendering as untranslatable, see emotional category, longing, which I was beginning to suspect was not the right translation at all, that the app was reaching for the closest human word and landing on something softer and smaller than the actual meaning. I said, "You could have told me, at the beginning, before day 23. She wrapped both hands around her tea mug. She said, "I was not certain you would stay." I nodded. I looked at my notebook, open to a page of observations I had been making for 4 days, field notes on an experience I had not understood I was in the middle of. I picked up my pen. I wrote, "Day 25. She was not certain I would stay." Then I put the pen down and drank my tea and did not say anything else, because there was nothing else to say that the staying had not already said. Lon left an hour later. It had filled 6 pages of its data pad. It handed me a business card for the GHA review board and told me, in the tone of someone delivering information they found genuinely unprecedented, that my case had been flagged for further documentation. I used the card as a bookmark for my thesis notebook. The building thread had gone quiet. 3 units had relocated. The Threx couple was still there, still arguing, but at a lower volume. The Meridian student had stopped playing the funeral hymns. The apartment smelled like thunderstorms and museums. It smelled like something I did not have a word for yet. Vethka built a second extension onto the nest shelf that afternoon. It was larger than the first one. It went almost to the other wall. I ducked under it on my way to the bathroom that night. I did not think about it until I was already in bed, and then I thought about it for a while, the way you think about a thing that has already happened and that you are only now beginning to understand the shape of. Then I went to sleep. In the morning, there was a message from my thesis advisor in my email. It said, "I have heard something extraordinary. I think we need to talk." I put my phone face down. I made coffee. I made soup. The GHA review board met in a building on the north side of Portland that looked, from the outside, like a bank that had lost confidence in itself. 3 floors, gray walls, a lobby with 4 different species worth of waiting chairs arranged in a configuration that satisfied none of them fully. I sat in the human chair, which was at least correctly sized, and I waited. I had been notified of the review 11 days after Administrator Lon's visit. The notification came by official mail, physical paper, GHA seal in the upper left corner, language formal enough to suggest that whoever drafted these letters had never once been asked to make them sound friendly. It informed me that my case had been forwarded to the Regional Cohabitation Ethics and Safety Board for review of the circumstances of my continued residence in Unit 4C during active Veldara conditions, and that my attendance was requested on a date that was printed in a font that I felt communicated urgency. I brought my thesis notebook. There were 5 board members. I will not try to name all the species because honestly 2 of them I had never encountered before, and my app was working at roughly 40% on both of them. What I can tell you is that the board chair was a Threx, ancient and deliberate, and carrying the particular stillness of someone who has been doing very serious work for a very long time and has made peace with all of it. She had been on this board, according to the placard in front of her, for 211 years. I sat across from them at a table that was too large for the room and answered their questions. The questions started formally. They had Lon's report. They had the cognitive assessment scores. They had the timeline, day by day, of my continued presence in the unit. They asked me to confirm each data point, which I did, and each confirmation seemed to produce, in at least 3 of the 5 board members, a quality of attentive stillness that I associated with people encountering something they had not expected. The Threx chair let the others ask their questions first. Then she folded her hands on the table and looked at me with eyes that had been reading situations for 2 centuries, and said, "Mr. Calloway, we have reviewed Administrator Lon's assessment. We have the cognitive disruption scores. We understand what was happening in that apartment biologically and chemically." She paused. "What we are trying to understand is why." I said, "Why I stayed." "Why you stayed," she said. I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the post-it note that Owen had left. I thought about the way I had stood in that kitchen reading it and then thrown it away without showing it to anyone. I thought about my sister's number in my phone, the one I almost called and then didn't, the drafts of texts I had written and deleted over the last 3 years. I thought about being the last person picked and how you learn to make a game out of it, how you develop a very specific kind of competence at endurance, because endurance is the skill you get when you don't have the others. I said she hadn't eaten, and the nest shelf had a dissolving mechanism, so the security deposit was fine. The young board member to the far right, a Mreedan, the same one from floor 3 whose funeral hymns I had been hearing through the ceiling for weeks, looked at me with an expression that was trying very hard to be professionally neutral and not entirely succeeding. She wrote something down. The Threx chair said, "Those are reasons. Those are not why." I looked at my notebook on the table in front of me. I had brought it out of habit, and now I was glad I had, because it gave me somewhere to look that was not the 5 faces waiting for me to answer a question that had a real answer that I was not sure I was ready to say out loud. "I know what it feels like when someone leaves," I said. I decided I wasn't going to be that. Nobody spoke. I did not fill the silence. The Threx chair looked at me for a long time. Then she made a note, the kind of note that has weight to it, the kind you can feel being made even from across the table. Then the board member to my left, a Vreth who had been the most skeptical-looking of the 5, said, "Mr. Calloway, are you aware that in the event of a confirmed permanent anchor bond with a Vendari, there are documented biochemical effects that extend to the bonded non-Vendari individual?" I said I was not. He said, 3 cases in galactic recorded history, confirmed anchor bonds between Vendari and non-Vendari individuals. In all 3 cases, the biochemical stabilization produced by the bond extended the effective biological timeline of the non-Vendari cohabitant significantly beyond the standard species lifespan. I sat with that. "Significantly," I said. "The data set is small," he said. 3 cases. The extension varied, but the minimum observed was 140 years beyond typical species expectation. The room was very quiet. I thought about Veth Ka at the kitchen table. I thought about her patches settling into that warm, steady color after the soup. I thought about her saying, "I was not certain you would stay." I thought, she knew what the anchor bond meant biochemically. She knew, and she did not tell me, and she also did not push, did not maneuver, built the nest shelf and ate the soup and told me clearly, when I asked, what she needed, and then let me decide. I thought about whether that mattered. I reached a conclusion about whether that mattered. "That wasn't why," I said. The Vreth board member looked at me. "You had no knowledge of the lifespan extension data," he said. "None," I said. "And knowing it now," he said carefully, "does it change your assessment of your decision?" I looked at my notebook, page after page of field notes. Day 23, found the memo. Day 24, she hadn't eaten. Day 25, she was not certain I would stay. "No," I said. The Threx chair made another note. Then she looked at me with the look my thesis advisor had given me the first time I had presented my research proposal, the look that was not surprise exactly, but was something adjacent to it, the look of someone who thought they knew what category a thing belonged in and was being shown they were wrong. She said quietly, almost to herself, "Why did you stay?" And I said, "Because I had already said it, And it was still true. I know what it feels like when someone leaves. I decided I wasn't going to be that. She wrote something. She adjourned the board early. I watched her leave the room first, and then through the glass panel beside the door, I saw her sit down in the hallway on one of the waiting chairs and stay there, not moving, for a long time. I sat in the review room for a moment. The Meridian board member, Sari, whose funeral hymns I had been hearing through the ceiling for weeks, walked past me on the way out and stopped. She said, very quietly, "The hymns. From floor 3, you could hear them." "Some of them," I said. She looked at me. She said, "We sing them when we are afraid of losing something before we have had it. We do not usually sing them for people who are still present." She walked out. I sat with that for a minute. Then I picked up my thesis notebook and went to the lobby. My phone had 17 new emails from my thesis advisor. I had read the first 3 in the waiting room before the session. They ranged from excited to urgent to something I could only classify as academic glee, the specific fever of a researcher who has encountered data they were not expecting and cannot stop thinking about. The last one in the chain said, "Jesse, I spoke with Administrator Lon. I need you to know that what you have done here is not just personally significant. I believe you may have accidentally produced the most important piece of primary research in cross-species social bonding that this department has ever had access to. Please call me." I put my phone in my pocket. I took the bus home. I used the GHA business card they had given me as a bookmark for my notebook. At home, Vethka was at the kitchen table with her own data pads, working. Her patches were the steady, warm color that I had been thinking of as her working color, the one she had when she was focused and present and okay. She looked up when I came in. I said, "The board says hi." She looked at me. Her patches did the amber sweep. Then the pale gold. Then the color the app kept getting wrong. "How did it go?" she said. "They have a lot of questions," I said. I answered them. And? I took my jacket off. I hung it by the door. I went to the kitchen and poured 2 glasses of water. I set one in front of her. I sat down. "Did you know," I said, "about the lifespan data?" She was quiet. "Yes," she said. "Before Veldara?" "Yes." I nodded. I drank my water. "You didn't tell me," I said. "No," she said. Her patches were still. "I did not want you to stay for that reason." I thought about post-it notes. I thought about Owen's TV stand dent in the wall. I thought about a person who has been left enough times to know that being wanted for a reason is not the same as being wanted. I said, "Okay." She looked at me. "Okay," she said. "Okay," I said. Her patches did the thing the app called untranslatable. I opened my thesis notebook. I wrote, "Day 36. She knew. She wanted me to stay, because I chose to, not because I was promised something for choosing." I underlined it. Outside, the building thread was quiet. The relocated tenants had not come back. The Threx couple had resumed their normal, low-level domestic disagreement that had nothing to do with pheromones. The Meridian student had stopped playing the funeral hymns. The apartment smelled like itself, like what it had become, over 36 days, which was something I did not have a clean word for yet. I was working on it. Veldara ended on day 51. I know the exact day because Vethka told me, and because I had been keeping the field notes, and because on the morning of day 51 I woke up and the apartment smelled different in the way that air smells different after a long rain, cleaner and quieter, the way a sustained tension releases when you are not quite looking at it. I lay in bed for a moment and noticed the absence. Then I got up and made coffee. Vethka was already in the kitchen. She was standing at the counter with her own tea, looking at nothing in particular, and her patches were doing the slow, steady blue-green of resting, the color I had known for 14 months before any of this, the color that meant she was present and calm and fine. She looked, I thought, like someone who had come home after a very long trip. I said, "How do you feel?" She said, "Restored." I nodded. I poured my coffee. We stood in the kitchen together, which we had done hundreds of times in 14 months without it meaning anything in particular, and now it meant something I still did not have a clean word for, and we did not talk about it, and that was fine. That was, I was realizing, very us. I sent my thesis advisor the chapter draft that afternoon. It was called Cross-Species Cohabitation Under Biological Stress Conditions: Human Adaptive Response Patterns in Vindari-Veldara Contexts, and it was 42 pages long, and it contained 51 days of field notes, cognitive self-assessments, building-wide behavioral observations, and a framework for understanding human neurological tolerance for sensory extremity that I had built, piece by piece, on the back of not reading a memo for 3 weeks. My thesis advisor emailed back in 4 minutes. The email said, "Jesse, this is not a chapter, this is a paper. This is in fact multiple papers. Call me immediately." I called him. He talked for 40 minutes. I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets and listened and said yes, and I know, and I understand, and yes, at appropriate intervals. He said the GHA review board had already been in contact with the university. He said Administrator Lon had submitted a supplemental report that had been routed to 3 separate research departments. He said there was a journal that wanted to fast-track a version of the chapter for the next issue. He said, "Do you understand what you've done?" I said, "I've been in my apartment." He said, "Jesse." I said, "I know. I'll write the formal version." He said, "A journalist called." I said, "Absolutely not." He said, "They just want to." I said, "I will send you the full notes. You can talk to the journalist. I'm going to make dinner." I made dinner. The nest shelf in the hallway had dissolved, exactly as Vethka had said it would, on day 48, leaving the hallway clean and undamaged, not even a mark on the wall. I had noticed its absence the way you notice the absence of a sound you had gotten used to, a small gap in the texture of the familiar. The second extension had lasted longer. It dissolved on day 50. I had stood in the hallway on day 50, looking at the empty space, and felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not grief, not exactly. Something more like the recognition that something had been real, and had mattered, and was now at a new stage of being real. I went back to my room and wrote it in the notebook and moved on. On the evening of day 51, after dinner, Vethka came to the kitchen doorway and stood there. Her patches were doing something I had not seen before. Quiet, deliberate, a color that shifted once, twice, and settled into something that I could not look away from and could not name. She was holding something. It was small, approximately the size of a coin, irregular in shape, bioluminescent in the same frequency range as her patches, but fixed in color rather than shifting. A steady, warm glow. It sat in her palm, and it looked like it had been there a long time, worn at the edges in the way things are when they have been carried. She held it out to me. I looked at it, then at her. "What is this?" I said. "A resonance token," she said. "Vendari carry them from early adulthood. They are given to one's anchor. They are not transferable after giving." I looked at the token in her hand. I thought about 51 days of field notes. I thought about soup and tea and the nest shelf, and the building thread, and a Threx board chair who had sat in a hallway for a long time after an adjournment. I thought about a Meridian student who sang funeral hymns for things not yet lost, and who had, in the end, stopped singing them. I thought about my sister's number in my phone. I picked up the token. It was warm. It was lighter than it looked. It fit in my palm the way things fit when they were made to be held. Vethka's patches did the thing my app had been calling untranslatable for 51 days. I looked at my translation app. I looked at the word it produced, finally, after all this time, 3 seconds of processing delay, and then a different word than it had been giving me. Not longing. Chosen. Not remaining. Chose. I held the token. I did not say anything. She did not say anything. We stood in the kitchen in the quiet that had come after a long, extraordinary thing, and neither of us needed to explain it, because explaining it would have made it smaller, and it was exactly the right size. I called my sister that night. Not almost. not 3 drafts of a text and then the phone back in my pocket. I sat on my bed with the resonance token on the nightstand beside me, and I called her, and she answered on the 3rd ring, and her voice had the particular quality of someone who has been waiting for a call they did not want to admit they were waiting for. I said, "Hey." She said, "Hey." We talked for an hour. I will not tell you what we said, because it is not mine alone to tell. What I will tell you is that afterward I sat for a while, with my phone in my lap, and the token glowing softly on the nightstand, and I thought, this is what happens when you stay. Things start moving again. Things that have been held at a distance start being possible. I did not write that in the notebook. I did not need to. The next morning, I opened my email and found 3 messages about the paper. One from a journalist I had agreed to let my advisor handle, and one from the GHA Regional Compliance Office. The GHA message informed me that my case had resulted in a comprehensive review of the cohabitation protocol document, specifically the section advising mandatory relocation, and that a revision was being drafted that included, for the first time in the document's history, a section on voluntary anchor cohabitation by non-Vendari individuals, citing my case as the primary reference. It said my file had been reclassified from anomaly to foundational case. It said this in the same font and format and bureaucratic register as the original memo. I used the email as a mental coaster for about 15 seconds. Then I printed it and gave it to Vethka. She read it. Her patches did the pride color, the one the app called possessive, and she handed it back. "You will need to frame this," she said. "I'm going to use it as a bookmark," I said. She made the sound that was the color of a laugh. 3 weeks later, the paper was published. 2 weeks after that, a second paper was accepted. The second one was co-authored, Vethka and me, her xenobiology data combined with my anthropological field notes, and the journal called it a landmark contribution and used words like unprecedented and paradigm shifting, which are words I have always been suspicious of, but which I was willing to accept in this context because we had earned them, and also because my thesis advisor sent me a voice message of himself cheering that lasted 90 seconds. Sorry, the Meridian from floor 3 knocked on my door one evening, 2 weeks after the second paper was published, and asked if she could talk. I made soup, because apparently that was what I did now when people knocked on my door, and we sat at the kitchen table, and she told me about a Vendari colleague at the university she had been afraid of for 6 months, in the way that you are afraid of things that feel too large and too important to risk. I listened. I said, "What are you afraid of?" She said, "That they will not want me to stay." I thought about that. I said, "Have you tried staying and finding out?" She was quiet. She drank her soup. She said, "I sang the hymns too early." I said, "Grief works early sometimes. It doesn't mean the thing you're grieving hasn't happened yet." She looked at me. I said, "Go find out." She did. I will not tell you what happened, because that is not my story to tell either. What I will tell you is that the funeral hymns stopped, permanently, and that she started nodding at me in the hallway with a new quality to the nod, a quality that I recognized as the nod of someone who has been on the right side of a decision. The building thread was quiet. The Threx couple on floor 4 had resolved their houseplant dispute, or at least relocated it to a more manageable conflict, and their door sounded normal again, which is to say occasionally loud but not distressed. The apartment was the same apartment it had been for 14 months, plus 51 days, plus everything that had happened in between. The token was on my desk, beside my thesis notebook, where I could see it from the kitchen table. On the last day of the month, Vethka came out of her room and set the lease renewal on the kitchen table in front of me. 3 pages. GHA Standard Residential Lease Agreement. Her signature, already on the bottom of page 3, the bioluminescent imprint of her thumb mark in the designated space. I looked at the lease. I looked at her. She said, "Are you renewing?" I said, "Are you asking as a roommate or as an anchor?" Her patches did the amber thing, then the pale gold, then the color that used to come out as untranslatable and now came out as something else, something my app had learned, finally, after 51 days and 600 attempts. It came out as chosen, not remaining, chose. I picked up the pen. I signed all 3 pages. The galactic record for voluntary human anchor cohabitation with a Vendari during active Veldara is 51 days, held by one Jesse Calloway, PhD candidate, anthropology, Portland, who found the warning memo under his shoe on day 23 and decided to make soup. The record holding was not the point. The staying was the point. The staying was, it turned out, always the point. I put the signed lease on the counter and went to start dinner. Vethka picked it up and held it the way you hold a thing that means something, and her patches did the slow, warm, steady thing that meant she was present and calm and fine, and the apartment smelled like itself, like what we had made it into, and outside the city was loud and normal and completely indifferent to the small, extraordinary thing that had happened in Unit 4C of the Galactic Housing District 7, Portland Sector. I chopped onions. I made soup. I stayed.